So I had to be on live every single night, whether there was something worthwhile reporting or not. I remember being sent out by the assignment editor because I was told that there was a little boy who was beloved in his neighborhood who'd gotten run over by a car, and apparently everyone in the neighborhood adored him, and at the local blood donor, that everyone in the neighborhood would be there at 11 o'clock that night to give blood for the boy. And I got there, no one there but the nurse and me and my cameraman, and we go live, and of course I did the only thing one can do under the circumstances. I gave blood on the air and said, and people will be here soon to give blood for little Joey. I remember one night being sent because one of the tugboats, one of the fireboats, was sinking in the East River. And that's a good story. So we get out there, and at that time going live involved a lot of gear and cables. And so we get on a boat, we clamber onto the boat, and we get all ready, and we go live at 11, and the fire chief's in the other boat, and I go, "So tell me, Chief, why is your boat sinking?" And he looked at me live on television and said, "Mine isn't, yours is." And it turned out he was right. Ours was. Or we do things, they go live at a demonstration, and I'd be standing there reporting live, and the demonstration would move around the corner. And then you'd see us chasing it with cables. Well, that was fine. You could sort of do that. And then the guy that was leading the demonstration ran into an office building with a revolving front door. Well, you could do a lot of things with a cable, but honest to God, you could not get one of those suckers through a revolving door. So there I am, sort of stuck in a revolving door, going, behind me, way behind me here, is a man who says he wants to blow up the whatever. Get me out of this door. Yeah, live. My son once, I remember years later, sitting in a group of colleagues, and we were talking about a show and whether it should have been live or taped. And there were those of us who felt that taped was better, that getting it right was better than getting it fast. And there were those who said, no, the excitement of live is better. And my son, who was about 12 at the time, listened to us for a while, and finally he looked at us and he said, "You're all nuts." He said, "All of us sitting here in this room," he said, "that's live." And he pointed over to the television in the corner and he said, "That's television. Don't call it live or taped. It's television. It's not live. This is live," sitting in the room. And I thought, yeah, he doesn't work in television. Of course, now he does work in television.
Well, when you first started at WCBS, you were from Texas. Did you have an accent? Was there anything?
Oh, I never had much of an accent, but I guess I did. I think Lord knows I never tried to lose it. I've never been, to my shame or discredit or whatever, I've never had a speech lesson in my life. I have never been to any kind of TV school or charm school or journalism school, I might add. I do not have a college degree. But I wrote once that my bosses used to want us all to sound just alike. And I was only half serious in it, but I said that I had questioned them, where did they think we ought to sound as if we were from, and one of them suggested his office, because he'd never been anyplace else, but he'd been to his office. I've thought it was a shame, and I still think it's a shame, this everybody trying to sound alike on television. People who are raised on chicken fried steak in Texas do not sound the same way people who eat pulled pork in North Carolina, or people who are eating Ben & Jerry's in Vermont. And I think that's rather lovely. And I think television news has sadly contributed to the death of the regional accent in this country. And that's a damn shame. I always enjoyed it that Dan Rather never entirely lost his accent, or Bob Schieffer, or me, although I think I lost far too much of mine, though I didn't try. I sort of just pick up sounding like wherever I am. When I go back to Texas for any length of time, The next thing you know, I'm ending every sentence as though it were a question. I'm just fine. I sound just like Lady Bird Johnson when I do that.
You had started talking about you moved to NBC News.
Yeah, in 1974, I got a job offer from NBC News to cover the Congress, the House of Representatives. And I had had a couple of offers from the networks before to move from local to the networks. And I'd always turn them down because I had 2 kids. And I did not feel that I could travel as much as was required and raise my kids. But this job covering the Congress, I thought, well, okay, that won't require a lot of travel at all. They haven't, unless they've moved it, the Congress stays in the House of Representatives, and that's in the Capitol, and I know where it is. So I moved to Washington. I went to work covering the Congress, and I had a wonderful time. I really did. Occasionally I would sub over at covering the White House, and I hated it every time I did it. It was the difference between, at the White House, they sort of feed you news through a slot in the door, and then you had to have secret sources to talk to find out what was really going on. And back then they would do things like they had something called the lunch lid, and they would say the lunch lid is on. And what that meant was that everybody could go out for a 3-hour lunch, that nothing was going to happen for 3 hours, that no news would happen for 3 hours. Well, that certainly they couldn't get by with that today. Whereas as far as the United States Congress, I had 435 people, any one of whom would like to be on television on any given day. And if you fired a shot in the middle of them, they ran in 435 directions. Well, that was a lot more interesting than one guy who doesn't want to talk to you anyway. So I really enjoyed my time there, and I learned a lot about politics. And I came to agree with Sam Donaldson, a man whose work I've always admired. And one of the reasons I've always admired Sam was that Sam always took the attitude that covering the president was just like covering the mayor, only it was a bigger office, physically. But that you basically, it was the same thing. And politics worked the same, whether it was City Hall or whether it was the Congress of the United States. And I have found him in all these years to be more right than wrong on that subject. And I wish that more reporters would look at it that way and would lose whatever glazed eye feeling they have of, ooh, I'm on Air Force One, or ooh, I'm in the White House press corps, or ooh, I'm standing in front of the Senate. Oh, get over yourself. These are elected politicians. More often than not, they will lie to you if given the chance.
Now, how did you get that job? You really had no experience.
This is truly, I suppose, ironic that I had spent 8 months in Houston and 3 months, and 8 months. I spent 8 months in Houston and almost 3 years in New York covering crime, and NBC hired me to cover the House of Representatives. That either says something about the House of Representatives or NBC News or me. Why they felt that covering crime qualified me to cover politics, I don't know, but there you have it.
Was it something that you had to be aggressive at?
Yes, you absolutely did, because although I said they always wanted to talk to you, that was not true. They never wanted to talk to you unless it was in their interest. No politician does, unless it's in their interest. So you do have to be aggressive, and I like so many women my age who were part of that sort of first group that came in the door in television. It was said of us, oh, well, the only woman who would want this job, the only woman who would want this would be aggressive. Well, yeah. I learned you did have to be aggressive in that job, and then I learned I liked it. So I didn't see any problem with that. I am an aggressive person in many ways. I can be very aggressive with a notebook in my hand, believe me. Just as shy as I can be at a party.
What about the access that you had in terms of cameras and television?
Well, we had, at that time, we actually had more access than they have now. But even at that time, we felt that we didn't have much access. A tourist with a camera, a little movie camera, could walk up and down the halls of one of the congressional office buildings. rolling, whereas I had to get the permission of every office I passed to walk down that hall with my NBC News camera. So in a sense, there was less access, but in another way, there was more. Our offices, our offices were right there in the Capitol building, upstairs. We had tremendous access to go and call these people and talk to them, even if we didn't have a camera running, to get to them, to get answers from them. And we, of course, did not have to go through searches or any of the metal detectors, none of that. You know, we parked right there. We walked 30 feet. And we took an elevator up to our offices, ABC, CBS, and NBC, 3 closets next to one another. And PBS. And PBS, because that's where I came to know Cokie Roberts and Linda Wertheimer, two of my favorite women, and Nina Totenberg, although she was usually over in that other building at the Supreme Court.
Now, did you have assignments, or did you...
Well, the assignments really, for the most part, were depending on what the Congress was doing at the time. If they had a particular bill that was big and they were voting on, that was your assignment. Other than that, you had to work up news just like at any newspaper or any news organization in the world. And there's a difference between working up a news story and making up a news story. One is better than the other. Let me be clear. Working up a news story is better than making up a news story. But there was never a shortage of stories when you're covering the Congress. There really is no shortage of stories.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, of course I did. I had a ball. I'm competitive as hell. And the fact that the 3 networks and PBS, the fact that we were right by each other day after day after day and hung out together and were friends only increased our competition. And I loved beating the competition. Loved it. Thought it was great. Still do.
Was there a specific scoop that you can bring up about that?
You know, this is where the memory goes. If there's one I've written about you want me to talk about, I'll be happy to. But I forget. You know, when you've done this as long as I've done it, now I guess it's close to 40 years, you start to forget so much. I said to somebody before we did this interview, I said, my God, I should have sat down and read at least 2 of my last 3 books before to prepare for this. I have forgotten so much.
Okay, let's talk about a scoop that didn't happen with the House of Representatives, but a political convention.
Oh, well, yes. Okay, political conventions. I was not on the floor that year. I was not covering on the. I was not a floor reporter, and that was 1976, and it was the New York Democratic Convention, and I was bored out of my mind. I assume you were talking about the button. Yes. Mm-hmm. Bored out of my mind. There was nothing to cover on the perimeter, which is what I was assigned. That meant I was there to cover demonstrations. Well, there weren't any. So a producer that I knew and worked with, I had gotten to know in the course of just hanging around the convention, having nothing to do. I had met a fellow who manufactured campaign buttons. You know, buttons that have sayings on them. And he said that indeed he was going to be printing the button that said Carter and, you know. And I said, do you know what the and is? And he said, well, I do. And I said, will you tell me the and? No. And so in talking more, I discovered that they were going to I discovered where his button manufacturing company is in Manhattan, and that they were going to roll on the buttons in order to have them ready for the next morning. When they announced it to hand out to everybody, they were going to print the buttons that night. So the producer and I went down. It was in the 20s. I mean the streets of the 20s, not the temperature. It was August. And, you know, we got into the building the way every kid in New York knows that you get into a building, which is you ring every buzzer and somebody will eventually answer. And we went to the top of this brownstone, and it was just absolutely opposite where the printing press was. And, you know, we had told our producer we were going to go do this. And he said, okay, but I don't know any of you. And if you get arrested, don't be calling me for bail. That was a line I was to hear a number of times in my career. And if you get arrested, don't be calling me for bail. We said, fine. So we get over there, and we're waiting, and we're going to break the story of who the vice president's going to be. And we're waiting, and we're bored, and the presses aren't running. And so we began to talk, and he started to tell me about, he had just come back from Afghanistan or some place where there had been folk dancing. And he said, let me show you. And he starts clogging about on the roof, and I get up and I start clogging about with him on the roof. And the next thing you know, the door to the roof pops open, and people from the apartments below come up, and one of them has a gun. He's pointing it at us. And, you know, we were just so stupid, we forgot that our dancing on the roof, that they could hear it. And, you know, I've never forgotten what the producer did. He threw his hands in the air, and he said, don't shoot, we're harmless, we're journalists. And the guy with the gun said, that may be, but get off our roof. And as we turned to go off the roof, I could see the presses start to roll across the street. Ka-cha-boom, ka-cha-boom. And I'm going, wait a minute, I just have to see what the name is on that button. And somebody picked me up and pushed me right onto the stairs, didn't push me down the stairs, and said, down the stairs you go. Missed my scoop. There, it was Mondale, by the way.
Did you do a lot of that kind of thing? Were you very proactive that way?
Did some crazy things. I had a reputation for doing some crazy things. When they brought the Americans that had been held captive at the embassy in Iran back to America, they brought them to Stewart Air Force Base up at West Point. And they weren't going to allow any crews at Stewart Air Force Base to see the plant with the 400 and some odd Americans land. But anybody who was in the Army or whose family was in the Army could stand on that runway with a camera and shoot it. But we couldn't. So I had been over there earlier that day with my cameraman, and we discovered the old control tower by the runway, because they hadn't shut the base down yet. It wasn't time. The plane wasn't coming. You could wander all around. And we went up there, and I said, you know, the plane's supposed to get there the next morning, like 8. I said, if we camped out here overnight in this control tower, that plane's going to land right here. And when it lands, if we just pop up and start shooting, we'll get the shot, and no one else will. And he thought that was a good idea, and our sound man thought that was a good idea. And again, I went to the producer, Nightly News, and he said again, okay, I approve of it, but I never said that. I never met you. I don't even know you. And don't be coming for me for bail money. I learned later on that another producer had gone around and collected bail money for us just in case. So we get out there with our parkas, and, you know, we bundle up in this top of this old control tower, and we spend the night talking and sleeping and talking and sleeping. And we wake up that morning. Sure enough, here comes the plane. Plane lands. The prisoners start to come off, pop up with our cameras, start shooting, and the cameraman says, that's not good enough. I'm going to get out on the runway. So we go running down the stairs. He goes running out on the runway. Well, of course, that was our mistake. And the Army police got us and escorted us to our car instantly. Happily, didn't take the time to arrest us, just said, get out of here and get in the car. So what we did, and as we did, the former prisoners, now freed, are piling onto the buses, and they're going to go through the town, which is lined on both sides with people and flags. And it's going to be a big parade of them on their buses. And the first bus pulls out, and there's 4 buses. First bus pulls out, and I realize what's going on. The second bus pulls out, and I turned to my cameraman. I said, step on it. Get in the parade. So he pulled out, and then the last bus pulled out behind, and we're in between the buses. Well, what happened was, it was a rental car, and it had Canadian license plates on it. Okay. Now you will remember that during the siege, and when the Americans had been held captive, that Canada had hidden a number of the Americans in its embassy in Iran. So people in the parade saw us and thought that we were part of the Canadians who had helped save Americans. And they began to tie ribbons on our car and wave at us. And, you know, we're shooting all these faces, glowing faces that are waving at us, thinking we're Canadian. But they could have been waving, and they were also waving at the people on the buses. We have this great shot from within the parade. We have the view no one has of the whole parade of all of these fabulous American faces. NBC had plenty of cameras along the parade route shooting the people in the buses, but you could barely see them. But what nobody had, except us, was this wonderful sight of the faces of America greeting the returning hostages. Well, we had that. And that worked out nicely, except that, and I got back, and the same executive producer said, okay, you lead the show. And I said, no, that's not right. My friend George Lewis was the lead reporter for tonight. This footage should go in his, because we're the only camera, not to forget the parade, we're the only people who had the plane landing. And the people getting off the plane. He said, this should go. I said, this should go in George's piece. He said, but George didn't get the shot. I said, well, it doesn't matter. It should go in. He said, I said, you land. It's a pretty autocratic place, you know, a newsroom. He said, I said, you're leading the show. And I said, you know, it would be awful if I couldn't find that tape, wouldn't it? And he looked at me and he said, you wouldn't. And I said, well, you know how I am about losing things. What if I lost that tape of the plane landing? He said, you wouldn't do that, Ellerbee. I said, it's entirely possible. He said, give the tape to George. George will lead the show. And George came to me later and he said, you're the only reporter I know that would turn down the lead on the show. And I said, George, the fun was in getting it. I didn't care about being on the air with it. The fun was in getting it.
It's a great story. So you also, at that point, spent a week as co-host of Today.
I did. I was just terrible at it, too. I was. It was the very first time that I anchored anything was on Channel 2 when Rollin Smith went on vacation, and they asked me to sit in on the 11 o'clock news with Dave Marish for a week, and I was so bad they never, ever asked me back to anchor again.
Why were you bad? What did you do?
I didn't know how to read a teleprompter, for one thing. And the idea of the live anchoring just terrified me for reasons. I was quite capable of going on the air live and talking all I wanted, but sitting and reading moving words on a screen seemed to me to be an unnatural act. So we're now, Barbara Walters is leaving. I'm at NBC News. Barbara Walters is leaving the Today Show. And there are 5 of us that NBC has designated that one of us will follow her, whether we want to or not. And each of us will do a week on the air with Lloyd Dobbins, who was sitting in because he was not going to be the person who would have to anchor with the new one. And NBC wisely decided that rather than having Tom Brokaw sit in with the people that were being auditioned, that it should be someone who wasn't going to have any say in it or anything. And there's a thing on the Today Show, and I don't know if they still have it. It's time that they used to cut away for the local news within the Today Show, and not all stations had a local Today cut in. So during that time, on the Today Show itself, on the set, you would have this chit-chat about the news, you know, or about something, or about each other, didn't matter, chit-chat. So they said, well, what are you and Lloyd going to chit-chat about, you know, in the first local, in the cutaway? And Lloyd said, for example, are you married? And I said, yes. And he asked who to, and I told him the name, and Lloyd looked at me and he said, I fired that son of a bitch, and I'd do it again. Well, the chit-chat came, and Lloyd and I chit-chatted about the federal budget. But Lloyd and I became good friends, and we've often joked since that time that the one thing we had in common was that at different times and for different reasons, we both fired the same man.
Speaking of Lloyd, you then went on to work with him on Weekend.
I went on to co-anchor with Lloyd on Weekend, which alternated with Saturday Night Live once a month. Saturday Night Live was on 3 Saturday nights a month, and Weekend was on the 4th. Because they didn't think this new show could carry itself, could carry an audience.
Talking about SNL.
Yeah, SNL, exactly. And after the first couple of years, it became clear that it could. And so Weekend was moved to prime time and another night, which was a polite way of killing the show off. Fred Silverman was head of NBC at that time, and he really did not want a news show in his primetime schedule. And so he kept moving the show around. Now, the show was called Weekend, and I remember one night having to go on the air and say, "Good evening, I'm Linda Ellerbee, and the name of this program is Weekend. Yes, I know it's a Wednesday. Try to think of weekend as a state of mind. We do." And that was a good show. That was a wonderful show, and that's where I really began to work in documentary style, and really began to work to learn to write to picture instead of write to speed. And that's where I was fortunate enough to meet and become a pupil of Reuven Frank, to my mind, one of the greatest people ever in this business. And Lloyd and I worked it together until that show was canceled, and then I went back to become a special political correspondent for NBC, and that went on until 1981 when CNN went on the air in 1980 and scared the devil out of the networks. And their fear was that if people wanted news 24 hours a day, by golly, the broadcast networks had better figure out a way to give it to them before it lost its entire audience to CNN. At that time, there really was nothing on. Most of the three networks, they went to black for the middle of the night, you know. There was nothing on. It'd sign off, play the Star-Spangled Banner, show the flag, sign off till the following morning. So they had come up with a show at NBC. Each of the networks came up with a late night, or in CBS's case, all-night show, 4-hour show. And NBC's entry was a show called NBC News Overnight. And Lloyd and I were to write and host that. And Herb Dudnick was the original producer of the show. Reuven was the founding father, and it was really, the inmates got to run the asylum. It really was. We got to put on the show that we'd always wanted to, the news show that those of us who reported the news always had wanted to put on, for the main reason being that all our employers were old and asleep at that time of night. And VCRs weren't that common then. So they didn't see us. They really didn't see us. And we got to make the stories run longer. We got to cover. We didn't have money to send crews out to cover. So we would cover, say, for example, the Senate hearings on the new Secretary of State because we got a lot of foreign coverage for free, by showing how the 4 major NATO allies covered the United States hearings for the new Secretary of State, which was a great idea because it gave you 2 streams of information. Not only what was going on in the U.S. Senate, but what the major U.S. allies thought of what was going on in the U.S. Senate. And we would go around and I would talk to editors at local stations all around the country, video editors. And I would tell them, take your outtakes, take things, put together pieces for us, cut them to music, take chances, do odd things. And then we would tell the NBC reporters, we would say, look, we know that nightly news cut your story to 1:30 because they cut everybody's story down to 1:30. And we know that the Today Show only wanted 2 minutes, but they only want the lighthearted part of your story. We'll take what you think the story should have been on the air, but we can't pay you the extra to stay and cut it. You have to want to do it. Well, they all wanted to do it because they all wanted to prove to Today Show and Nightly how it should have been done. So they'd stay. And we would get, as Herbie said, he said, out of 5 stories, 2 will be okay, 1 will be so-so, 2 will be pretty good, and 1 will be terrific. And that turned out to be true. I remember a story that Andrea Mitchell did that I'm not sure you could get on the air now. This was when Reagan was president. And it was a story about the fact that Reagan was the photo op president. And why not? After all, he had been an actor. And it was picture after picture of, and we explained that a photo op was an opportunity to, was a lack of opportunity to do anything but take a photograph. And she said lines, like, well, riding a tractor in Iowa is a lot easier than explaining the deficit. And she had, when somebody else would do a picture on the fact that Ronald Reagan loved to salute because he knew how from the movies, and that he saluted everyone. And they had collected footage of him saluting everyone in the world. And I, people have said, oh, you must be anti-Reagan. No, we didn't have a show when Carter was on the air. When Carter was president. It was just that simple. Reagan was president while Overnight was on the air. It wasn't Reagan we were making fun of or taking shots at or questioning. It was power, which always deserves being questioned. Always. That. If there's one job we're there to do, it's to question power and those in power. But Overnight was just a chance for everybody to do their best without the politics that goes on in the average newsroom. And for some reason, it connected, and we got. I've always referred to it as that we had a cult following, because the cult is when you're not big enough to make a minority. We had such press, you wouldn't believe. If as many people had seen the show as wrote about it, I think we'd still be on the air. But a part of our problem was they had no way then to rate anything after 11:30 at night. There literally was no mechanism for the ratings for anything after 11. So there was no way to rate college dorms, hotels, hospitals, any place where people might gather. And the home ratings all shut off at 11:30 because TV did. The Nielsen boxes, they just all went silent. Which was a shame. It was a remarkable opportunity, and I'll never get another one like it. To say pretty much whatever I wanted to say within the bounds of good journalism, and the FCC, and the rules of good journalism. We were not Fox. We did not call ourselves fair and balanced we did not pretend to be news while being something else. We were not MSNBC in that sense either. We were the news. And we did an essay at the end of the show, and we alternated each night on who did that essay. And that was clearly a thought piece. But that was clearly a separate thing from the rest of the show. And we figured the audience was smart enough to figure out that if you start by saying, I think, that what follows is not news, it's your thoughts. And you're not trying to pass it off as a news story. My goodness, how I do go on about Overnight. When it was canceled, things got even stranger. People began to send letters like crazy to NBC. They sent money, dollar bills, checks. They said there was a Save Overnight campaign. We would see news stories there was a strike in Boston, and they were throwing a guy in the paddy wagon, and he's screaming, down with the scabs, up with the union, save Overnight. And we would see these Save Overnight buttons on the White House correspondents of other networks. And there were candlelight vigils at RCA, it was RCA then, and then GE and now Comcast, at 30 Rock. Let's call it 30 Rock. There were candlelight vigils. It was really crazy. But corporations never blush. The show went off the air anyway.
Well, why do you think it had that kind of following?
I think because in some way, by our absolute candor, we were able to erase part of that screen that divides those of us who deliver the news from those who receive the news. That was my tummy growling. We never pretended that we knew more than we knew. And if there was one key to Overnight, is that we always, always operated on the assumption that the person watching had at least as much sense, if not more, than we did. We never ever talked down to our viewer.
Did you think that other...
Yes, I still do. I think that is the biggest flaw in television news, is that most people who make television news believe that they are smarter than most people who watch television news. And as a consequence, instead of giving their very best, they give you what they think you need, or what they think you want, or at least what they think you will not want to miss. And until we get by that, we will never be any better than we are.
How can we get by that?
I think you have to go almost door to door to the people that put television news together and say, do you understand what a jerk you can be compared to, I always refer to him as the plumber in Albuquerque, who's probably smart as you are. At least he's got steady work. You work in television. And until you start treating people with respect and as though they're smart, it's not going to change. And I don't see it changing. I still see the writing dumbed down for the most part. Now, having said that, you know, if I may quote the philosopher S.I. Hayakawa, all generalizations are false, including that one. I mean, there are people on television who are excellent, who are first rate, and about whom this cannot be said. I have never heard Christiane Amanpour talk down to her audience in her life, nor have I ever heard Ted Koppel do so. There are many who are world-class journalists, but the run-of-the-mill treats the audience as though the audience is not as smart as they are.
Do you think that comes more from the producer side than the...
It's a whole culture within television that somehow you have to, the idea that, you know, if it bleeds, it leads comes from that. The idea that the audience will only watch if it has explosions, that the audience will not care about the politics of Afghanistan. They simply want to see if there's another suicide bomber. And this thread sort of runs through it. And now, after all these years, the sad thing is, part of me has come to believe, and to believe that we're greatly at fault for this, that it's almost true. Not that we're smarter than they are, but that the audience, that the appetite for the bottom-feeding stuff has grown. See, I don't think there's anything wrong with liking a little trash in your news. There's a little trash in all of us, darling. I have never been to a murder or a war or an automobile accident that didn't draw a crowd. There is that in all of us. But where we go wrong is thinking that that's all there is. Because the same people that will stop and rubberneck at an automobile wreck and really like it if there's a lot of blood and, you know, body parts strewn around are the same people that will climb down a well to save a child or cry at a parade when the flag goes by, you know, or give up their life for someone else's, or sing at the sunrise just because it's beautiful. We are all of us more than one thing, and to presume that each of us is one thing and that we will only respond to one kind of thing is bad. Although today the ratings seem to be saying that as a group, we, and I have to include me there when I talk about the audience, because I'm also part of the audience. I'm on both sides of that camera. That we as an audience have come to really want our explosions and our fires and our body parts. And the reason I say I don't think the audience is entirely to blame is because if you only feed people that, how are they ever going to develop an appetite for more? And we in television news have fed them that for so many years that we must stand responsible if they're not really interested in the budget.
Do you think when you started your career in news, did you feel like it was a business?
When I started my career in television news, I never expected to stay in it. I always thought it was, I wasn't sure what it was, but I thought it was something I was passing through. I thought it was journalism. I learned right smartly that it was also a business. But it was much less of a business then. It's, as many people I'm sure have told you, that if you go back to the Communications Act of 1934, it's right there that the airwaves are owned by the public. We, the people of the United States, grant you, the broadcaster, the right to make a lot of money on these airwaves that we own, in return for which the rent that you will pay for the money you're going to make on something we own, the rent you will pay will be public affairs, news, and documentary programming. And it was not expected to make money. It was the rent you paid. It didn't matter if it got ratings or if it made money. It was the rent you paid. It was the right thing to do. And you had to do it, or the FCC would yank your license. Well, television didn't make money. And it really didn't get a lot of viewers until one show came along. And that was 60 Minutes. And it didn't get viewers for the first 7 years it was on the air. And then all of a sudden it was in the top 10, and I believe still is all these years later. And how can you fault 60 Minutes? It's a damn good show. But the leap was not far in the bean counters' minds from a television news show can make money to, it's a very short leap from there to a television news show must make money. And that leap was made fairly rapidly after that. And after that, everything was changed forever. And then with the advent of 24-hour news, it was once again changed forever again.
Did you feel it yourself?
Sure, we all felt it. When GE bought NBC from RCA, GE had a hard time understanding news culture, the firehouse culture. They couldn't understand why you needed to keep some of the firemen in the firehouse in case another fire broke out. They wanted to know, well, why is this reporter, why aren't all the reporters out at all times covering everything? And I mean, there was a very famous story, a tragic story, not for him, but for the other people involved, of the bureau chief in NBC that was hired by GE, and he was determined, NBC being the largest of Washington, he was hired as the bureau chief in Washington, let me get this straight, being the largest of all the NBC bureaus, and he worked on the theory that every one of us had to be out every day covering something. And so he would send us to hearings, and there are enough congressional hearings that you could throw 1,000 reporters at them and still not cover them all. But every one of us had to go to one of these hearings every day. But the trouble is, when you're in a hearing, congressional hearing, once you get in there, they shut those doors. You and your camera are locked down. You cannot leave that room until the hearing breaks for lunch or for a vote, roll call, something like that. You can't go anywhere. But on his head count, it was perfect because everybody was out, covering something every day, until an Air Florida plane taking off from National Airlines clipped the 14th Street Bridge and went into the Potomac River. And NBC News didn't have a crew to cover it, and didn't get on the air with the story till some 4 hours later after the other networks. Now, he lost his job. That's not quite the same as all those people who lost their lives. But it was clear that the business part had taken over, and GE commissioned a consulting firm to come in. And for each one of us on the correspondence, they counted up the number of minutes that we were on the air in the previous year and divided into our salary that we made. And they went, well, this one can't be worth that because, look, she was only on X minutes. Well, if you do investigative reporting, you're not on every night. You actually have to go out and investigate, if you will, and find out the story. So someone like Brian Ross, who was then at NBC, a first-rate investigative journalist, but he's not on every night. Well, the numbers did, well, why do we want to keep this guy? Or Linda Ellerbee, who does long, involved stories. Well, why do we want to keep her? She's not on. Look, for goodness sakes, look what we're paying her. For this amount of minutes, we could hire 4 people who can be on every single night for that. Yeah, it was different.
Wow.
It was different.
I want to go back and talk about a few other shows that you did. Summer Sunday.
Ooh, I still shudder at that one. That was, once again, we had a brand new president of NBC News. I worked for 5, but I was only there 11 years. I have friends who have worked for far more presidents of NBC News. 12 years, I guess I was there.
What do you think makes up for that turnaround?
Well, it was after it started having to get ratings and make money. Then, if it didn't, you whack the football coach. It's the same as a football team. You start by firing the coach. So that was the basic reason. This Summer Sunday was a show about a piece of technology, a truck. It was all it was about. It was a show about a truck. NBC had a new truck. Now today this sounds very dated, but it was 1984, and this truck, we could broadcast live from anywhere in the world with our truck. So NBC News decided to build a show around it, and every Sunday that summer we would be somewhere else in the United States broadcasting live, doing an hour show on a Sunday evening from somewhere. Well, it was a terrible show to begin with. It was, and you know, if you have as the centerpiece of your journalism a piece of technology, a truck, you can almost guarantee that there are going to be technological failures, and that truck is going to interfere with your journalism. And that truck cut a swath through our journalism all summer, to the point that those of us who worked on the show were ready to set fire to that truck by the end of the summer. It was hideous. Mics didn't work. Pictures didn't come up when pictures were supposed to come up. You know, and then there's always just the human factor. We were in San Francisco for the Democratic Convention in 1984, and Louis Farrakhan at that time was much in the news and saying highly incendiary and what some people thought were racist things. And he couldn't come to San Francisco, but he was in Detroit, and he was going to be live from Detroit, and we would all be live. The panel interviewing him would be live in San Francisco at the convention. Some very famous senators and people on this panel, and I'm moderating it. And I have the IFB in my ear, the interrupted feedback, which allows me to hear Mr. Farrakhan, Reverend Farrakhan in Detroit, and everybody else has one on the panel, has one in their ear. And then he's wearing one, so we can all, through the magic of technology, hear one another and have a conversation about these incendiary remarks. The show starts and we go on the air, and we can't hear Farrakhan. Farrakhan can hear me. I'm the only one he can hear. He can hear me. He cannot hear any of the other people on the panel. And this goes on, and this goes on. And finally I said, I'm putting a stop to this. I apologize. I don't know what has gone wrong, but this isn't working. Reverend Farrakhan, I want to thank you. Now we could hear him and me. We're the only two, couldn't hear anybody else. I want to thank you for being here. I can only apologize to our viewers. Well, we finish. What happened? Well, it turned out, of course, in this case, it wasn't even a technological error. It was a human failure. It was one of the technicians who came up and he said, well, Linda, I knew you were used to working with an IFB, you know, and hearing all this stuff in your ear, but those other three people on the panel, they don't work in television, and I thought they'd be confused hearing all this stuff in their ear, so I unplugged theirs. So I guess there's really no technology that can screw with us as much as we can screw with ourselves.
Was there any blowback for that happening?
Oh yeah, people wrote to us. Even people called us racist. White Southern Baptists called us racist for not giving, Farrakhan his say. I mean, they all blamed me. They all said, you didn't let him talk. No, we just couldn't. We tried. It just didn't. It was television. It's only television. God, yeah. But people watching television, even smart people, they make silly mistakes. Every network I've worked at, after the evening news, if you're hanging around the newsroom, you answer the phone calls. And I don't know if you can still get through to them today, but you used to. And I can't tell you the number of times at NBC Nightly News that I would pick up the phone at NBC Nightly News, and they'd say, I want to talk to you about what Walter Cronkite said on your show tonight. I'd say, no, ma'am, that's CBS. Their number is, I'd give them the number. After a while, you do start to think we all look alike.
Did you start to feel, though, that you were a star in that sense?
No, I don't think so. I have never felt that I was a star, and I've certainly never looked the part. No. Television stars are people that anchor the Today Show or nightly news, or real television stars aren't on the news. They're doing sitcoms. Hugh Laurie, that's my idea of a television star. I do like House. Yeah, Hugh Laurie. People on television, I don't think of as stars in that sense anyway, and if they are, I'm certainly not one of them.
Well, let's jump ahead a little bit. You talked about sitcoms, and one of the classic things in the sitcom world is that Murphy Brown.
Somehow I know where you're going here. Well, is it based on me? Yes and no. Diane English, the executive producer, called and she said, Candice Bergen and I, my book at that time was way up on the bestseller list. A book I'd written about a humorous look at television news that I had written called And So It Goes. And they said, we want to do a sitcom about an anchor woman whose mouth is always getting her into trouble with her bosses. Can we follow you around for a month? And I said, well, you could, but I just quit my job yesterday. And they said, well, can we interview you? Can we talk to you? Can we do this? And can we rip your book off? Yeah. Now, after that, I think it evolved. It began to be based on many of us, women that work in television news. I'm certainly not the only woman that it was based on, but to a certain extent, I guess since they've said yes, I guess I have to say yes. I know that I played myself 3 times on Murphy Brown and gained a great respect for actors. Whatever they do, they're not paid enough. The first time that I was on, and Diane English, she said, every word that I wrote for you, I thought, is this Ellerbee like? And she said, I'd say it to myself and think, is this Ellerbee like? And I said, well, that was really kind of you. Thank you. And there was the rehearsal. And I'm rehearsing a scene with Candice, and I kept blowing the line, getting it wrong. And Diane kept coming out, and she'd say, you're not saying it Ellerbee like. And I thought, well, if I'm Linda Ellerbee and I say it, isn't that Ellerbee like? Well, apparently it wasn't. And so finally I said to Diane, I said, you say it Ellerbee like, and I'm just going to copy the way you say it. And that's what we did. She gave it the delivery she wanted, and I just copied her delivery on it. And then it was Ellerbee like.
Did you feel it? Did you feel like, I'm really saying this, or did you feel like you were a character?
On that line, I knew I was playing a character because it wasn't how I would have said, but if it felt to her that it was Ellerbee like. For me, it was, the walking and talking and the hitting and the marks and the doing all of that stuff. There was a reason that I had not acted since playing a pumpkin in the 4th grade Thanksgiving pageant before then. It was enjoyable in a surreal kind of way, but nothing I would want to do for a living. Nothing I'd be in the least bit qualified to do for a living, I might add.
Was there any criticism for you playing yourself?
No. In fact, every journalist on television leapt to play themselves on Murphy Brown whenever they were asked, because you were just playing yourself on a show that everyone in television news loved, because it got so much right of what we were doing, and because it made fun of us in such wonderful ways. We did. We flat loved the show. There was no question about it. So there was no stigma about going on Murphy Brown and playing yourself. I had turned down a lot of movies. Would call up and say, we need a television reporter for our movie, for just a scene where a television reporter. Well, if you've ever watched those, the television reporter never comes off well. I mean, they always play a jerk. So I would always say no to those. The only 2 acting experiences I ever did were the Murphy Brown and then on Tanner 88, which was an HBO thing that I did. And that was too good to resist.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was they called and they said, will you play yourself? first of all, you know. And it was a 2-day shoot, and I got out there, and they only barely had a script, and they said, "You just wing it." I said, I'll just wing it. They said, "Yeah, you have a scene with this 12-year-old girl, then you have a scene with the candidate, and you'll just wing it." Well, the 12-year-old girl was Cynthia Nixon. Something I did not connect until years later when we produced her biography for Lifetime. And she said, "Do you remember that?" I went, "Oh God, no! You've grown up. How would I remember that? You know, you're not a child anymore." But that was a great deal of fun. That was once again a reminder that I did not want to act for a living.
And then more recently, you did the finale of Ellen.
Of Ellen, yes, and I did that because Ellen is a friend of mine. And again, she said, "Will you come on and just play yourself? Pretend that, you know, the conceit of the thing was that they were doing a documentary about it, and that I was producing a documentary about it. And there were a lot of, you know, famous people that came on, and famous actors that were on there. So that was kind of fun to, you know. I mean, like anybody else, I can be as starstruck as the next person in meeting a famous person. I have, oh my God, what we're talking about, Tanner, the thing I forgot to say was why I did it was because Robert Altman was the director. I completely forgot to say was I'd had a lot of calls of people saying, "Will you play a television reporter in our movie?" No. Well, you know, when they called, they said, "Robert Altman is on the phone for you." I said, "Okay." And when he told me what he wanted, I said, "Oh yeah, I'll do it. This sounds like fun. I'll try this." Yeah. That'll be hard to patch back, but nevertheless, Robert Altman, Tanner, 88. Ellen, it was her last show, and I wanted to go out and do that for her.
Actually, going back to Murphy Brown, you said that they actually trailed you when they were developing the series.
Well, they wanted to. I had just quit my job, so they couldn't. There was nothing to trail. I had just quit television and had just started Lucky Duck Productions, pointing like everybody knows. We're here at Lucky Duck. We're here at Lucky Duck Productions right now. We're in our conference room. When I left ABC in 1987, Rolf Tessum, who was one of the producers of Our World and an old and dear friend of mine, started Lucky Duck Productions. And the idea was that cable, now it's 1987, that cable couldn't continue to run I Love Lucy forever, that they were going to need independent production, and that there would be room for a boutique news production company that had not only experience in producing news and documentaries, but had the credentials to do it. And I asked Rolf Tessum to be my partner in this company, and we started Lucky Duck Productions. And Rolf was right in his assessment that they were going to need us, and there was going to be a lot of room for a company like ours. The trouble is he was about 2 years ahead of the curve. And we damn near starved to death for the first 2 years, and would have if I hadn't gone out and done a commercial for Maxwell House Coffee to keep the payroll going here. People think I got rich doing a commercial. No, all I got was an editorial about me in the New York Times saying that it would have been okay if Walter Cronkite had done a commercial for Arrow shirts, but it wasn't okay for me to appear in a commercial where I never even said anything good about Maxwell House Coffee. I said, "Here's Willard Scott," and then he said good things about it. Nevertheless, it kept the company going, it met the payroll, and it kept it going just long enough for PBS to walk in the door and us starting to do business, and then Nickelodeon walked in the door, and we haven't looked back since. So, you know, was it a good idea to do a commercial? Look, if I were still working at a network news division, I wouldn't do one. Right now, I wouldn't do one. I produce Nick News. I wouldn't do a commercial. Right then, I was trying to get a company going with a payroll to meet, and it was close up shop and head back to the networks with my tail between my legs, or do, oh God, which is all I had were offers to do talk shows. And frankly, I thought most talk shows at that time were more dishonest than commercials. I mean, we're talking about the years of Jerry Springer and all of this, and I couldn't go there. I thought a commercial was an honest sellout. So I went for the honest sellout. Saved Lucky Duck Productions and lived to get my journalistic reputation back.
Let's stop here to change the tape.